At a luxurious horse auction, a neglected, scarred horse was displayed, drawing laughter and ridicule from the crowd. Everyone saw it as worthless, unworthy of a second glance. But just when everyone thought it was over, a young man in simple clothes stood up and did the unimaginable. He bought the horse. What followed was a journey of unbelievable transformation. But can this broken horse truly recover from its tragic past? Stay tuned for the shocking and heartwarming story. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. No more waiting. The story begins right now. Who will start the bidding? Do I hear an offer? But the crowd was unmoved. Laughter rippled through the room and someone muttered, "What's the point? That horse isn't worth a dime." Whispers grew louder, laced with ridicule. The grand auction hall buzzed with murmurs and disinterest as the spotlight fell on a horse lying motionless in the center of the ring. The chestnut stallion's coat was marred with scars, telling silent stories of hardship and neglect. The auctioneer's voice rang out, desperate to spark interest. "It looks like it's given up on life," a woman in a designer dress remarked, her tone dripping with disdain. Others nodded, their judgments sharp and final. The horse's eyes seemed dull, its spirit crushed by years of suffering. In that grand, glittering hall, it was clear that this animal didn't belong. It was a spectacle of rejection, and no one spared it a second thought until the unexpected happened. From the back of the room, a chair scraped against the floor, breaking the rhythm of cruel remarks. A young man dressed in plain clothes and out of place amidst the polished crowd stood up. His voice was steady, though not loud. "I'll take him," he said, his words cutting through the air like a knife. Heads turned in disbelief. "Him? Are you serious?" a man sneered. But the young man ignored the chuckles and shaking heads. His eyes were fixed on the horse, and there was something in his expression that silenced even the harshest critics. The room fell into an uneasy quiet as he approached the ring. After completing the payment, the young man walked up to the fallen animal, crouching down to meet its gaze. The horse flinched but didn't turn away. The boy leaned closer, whispering something softly, words no one else could hear. To everyone's shock, the horse's ears twitched, and for the first time that night, it lifted its head. The crowd exchanged bewildered glances. "What does he think he's doing?" someone murmured. The days that followed were nothing short of astonishing. News spread quickly about the once forgotten horse, now thriving under the care of its unlikely new owner. The transformation was undeniable. The stallion, once deemed useless, began displaying remarkable strength and intelligence. Its gait was proud, its eyes alive with purpose. People who had mocked the young man at the auction started to wonder if they had been blind to something extraordinary. But what had the young man done to ignite such a change in the horse? And why did the bond between them feel so unshakable, as if their paths had been destined to cross? The answers to those questions were about to unfold in ways that no one could have predicted. The morning sun bathed the small, modest stable in a warm glow, as the young man, whose name was James, stood silently, watching the horse. He had named the stallion Blaze, inspired by the creature's ability to rise from the ashes, just as he believed this horse could rise from its past. Blaze stood stiffly in the corner, his muscles taut, his movements cautious. His scars, both visible and invisible, had built a fortress around his trust. James knew he had taken on an uphill battle, but something deep inside told him this horse was worth it. James spent hours sitting outside Blaze's stall, reading softly or simply existing in the horse's presence. He never forced interaction. He knew trust couldn't be rushed. On one quiet afternoon, as James sat with his back against the wooden panels, Blaze took a hesitant step toward him. The sound of hooves on the straw made James glance over his shoulder, his heart leaping at the sight. Blaze's ears twitched nervously, but for the first time he seemed curious rather than fearful. The breakthrough, however, didn't come without its challenges. The next morning, James decided it was time to lead Blaze out of the stable and into the Blue Ridge stables. As soon as the bridle touched Blaze's head, the horse reared up, letting out a panicked whinny that echoed across the field. James quickly let go, his hands trembling, but he didn't yell or scold. Instead, he stepped back, giving Blaze space, murmuring soothing words. It was clear that Blaze's scars ran deeper than physical pain. They were rooted in betrayal. As days turned into weeks, a pattern emerged. James would try, fail, and try again, each time making just the slightest progress. He began to piece together fragments of Blaze's story from his reactions. The way Blaze flinched at sudden movements or froze at the sound of raised voices hinted at a past filled with cruelty. James couldn't shake the anger that bubbled inside him at the thought of what Blaze must have endured. But that anger wasn't for Blaze to carry. James made a silent vow to replace every bad memory with one of kindness and patience. One evening, as the sky painted itself in hues of orange and purple, James decided to try something new. He brought out a brush, careful to move slowly as he approached Blaze. At first, the stallion stiffened, his muscles coiled as if ready to flee. But James's touch was gentle, his strokes rhythmic and reassuring. Slowly, Blaze's rigid stance softened. His head dipped slightly, and a soft exhale escaped his nostrils. For the first time, he seemed to relax under human hands. It was a small Daniele, but to James, it felt monumental. What James didn't know was that Blaze's transformation was stirring whispers in the town. Those who had mocked him at the auction were starting to notice. Some were curious, others skeptical, but all were waiting to see how far this unlikely partnership could go. As James stood beside Blaze that evening, brushing his coat under the fading light, he felt a flicker of hope. Yet deep down, he sensed that this was only the beginning. Something bigger was on the horizon, something that neither he nor Blaze could yet foresee. The days blended together as James and Blaze settled into their routine. Each morning, James would rise before dawn, his boots crunching on the gravel path leading to the stable. Blaze had grown accustomed to his presence, nickering softly when James appeared, though his guarded eyes still carried a hint of skepticism. It was progress, but James knew the road ahead remained long and uncertain. He didn't mind. He had learned to cherish the small Danieles, each glance of trust, every step closer. One afternoon, James decided it was time to test Blaze's boundaries further. He led the stallion to the open Blue Ridge stables, the rolling fields glowing under the golden sunlight. For a moment, Blaze hesitated, his hooves planted firmly on the ground as if afraid of what lay ahead. James didn't pull or push. Instead, he stood beside him, allowing Blaze to take his time. Finally, with a cautious step, the stallion moved forward. The sight made James's chest tighten. It was as though Blaze was learning to reclaim the freedom he had lost. But the serenity of the moment was shattered when a loud, sudden crack echoed through the field. Startled, Blaze bolted, his eyes wide with panic. James's heart sank as he sprinted after him, shouting the horse's name. Blaze galloped wildly, his movements erratic as he dodged invisible dangers in his mind. The past had come rushing back to him, and it was as if he were running from ghosts. James finally caught up to him near the edge of the Blue Ridge stables. His breath labored. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "You're safe now." That evening, as James sat outside the stable, his exhaustion evident, an older man approached. It was Mr. Dawson, a retired rancher who had been a quiet observer of James's efforts. "You've got a good heart, son," he said, his voice gravely with age. "But you can't fix what's broken if you don't understand where the cracks are." James looked up, confused. Mr. Dawson continued, "That horse has seen things, endured things that you can't imagine. If you want to help him, you'll need to find out where he came from." The words lingered in James's mind long after Mr. Dawson had left. That night he couldn't sleep. Questions swirled in his thoughts. What had Blaze endured? Who had hurt him so deeply? And why had no one cared enough to stop it? Determined, James made a decision. He would uncover Blaze's past no matter what it took. The horse deserved more than just a new life. He deserved closure. As the first light of dawn broke the horizon, James stood at the stable door, watching Blaze with a newfound resolve. The stallion looked back at him, his eyes calmer than before, as if sensing James's determination. The journey to uncover Blaze's story would not be easy, but James was ready. Little did he know, The truth he sought would challenge not only his understanding of the horse, but also his own beliefs about trust, forgiveness, and redemption. James's search for answers began with a visit to the Santa Fe auction house, where he had first laid eyes on Blaze. The manager, a stout man with a gruff demeanor, barely looked up from his paperwork when James entered. "That horse? You're better off forgetting about him," the man muttered, his tone dismissive. But James was persistent, his voice firm as he explained, "I need to know where he came from. I need to help him heal." After some reluctance, the manager sighed, pulling out an old dusty file. "This is all I've got. Don't expect much." The file was thin, containing only a brief description of Blaze and the name of his previous owner, Daniel Carter. James's heart sank at the lack of detail, but the name was a start. Carter's address was scribbled in the margins, a ranch on the outskirts of town. James thanked the manager and left, clutching the file tightly. As he walked back to his truck, a sense of unease crept over him. What kind of person had left Blaze in such a broken state? The drive to Carter's ranch was long and filled with uncertainty. When James finally arrived, he was met with a scene that mirrored his worst fears. The property was run down, the fences sagging, and the barn doors hanging loosely on their hinges. As he approached the house, an older man stepped onto the porch. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp but devoid of warmth. "What do you want?" Carter barked, his tone laced with irritation. James swallowed hard and introduced himself, explaining why he was there. At first, Carter refused to talk, dismissing Blaze as just another useless animal. But as James pressed, his persistence chipping away at the man's defenses, Carter's facade began to crack. He admitted that Blaze had been part of a string of horses used for grueling work, pushed beyond their limits with no regard for their well-being. He wasn't strong enough, Carter said, as if it excused his actions. James clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface, but he forced himself to remain calm. Before leaving, James asked one final question. "Why did you send him to the auction instead of putting him down?" Carter hesitated, his gaze faltering. "I guess I thought maybe someone would see something in him." "I didn't," he muttered, almost as if ashamed. James left the ranch with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. Blaze had endured more than he had imagined. The weight of the horse's past felt heavier now, but it also fueled James's resolve to make things right. That evening, back at the stable, James sat beside Blaze, running a hand gently along the stallion's mane. "I know where you came from," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise you'll never go through that again." Blaze turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting James's. For the first time, there was a flicker of trust, a silent understanding between them. The bond they shared was growing stronger, but James couldn't shake the feeling that this journey was far from over. The past had been uncovered, but it still cast a long shadow over their future. The truth about Blaze's past weighed heavily on James. The image of Carter's cold indifference and the conditions Blaze had endured replayed in his mind like a haunting memory. James spent hours sitting by Blaze's stall, sharing the silence with the horse. "You've been through hell," he murmured one evening, stroking Blaze's scarred neck. "But I promise, that's not who you are anymore." Blaze blinked slowly, his ears twitching as if he understood. For James, that small reaction was a glimmer of hope. The next day, James decided to test Blaze's progress again. He led him to the open Blue Ridge stables, this time carrying nothing but a halter and a lead rope. There was no pressure, only patience. Blaze hesitated at first, his hooves rooted in place, but James stood beside him, giving the stallion space to decide. After a long moment, Blaze took a step forward, then another, until they were both standing in the middle of the field. James couldn't help but smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As James continued working with Blaze, word of their bond spread through the small town. People began stopping by the stable, their curiosity piqued by the story of the auction reject and the determined young man. Some came to offer support, while others seemed to doubt James's efforts, their skepticism thinly veiled behind polite smiles. Among them was Sophie, a local veterinarian who had heard about Blaze's condition. "You're doing something incredible," she told James, her voice warm and sincere. "But he's going to need more than patience. His body has been through a lot." Sophie's words struck a chord with James. She offered to examine Blaze and help him develop a plan for the horse's recovery. James agreed, grateful for her expertise. As Sophie worked, she pointed out the areas where Blaze still carried tension, the physical remnants of his trauma. "This won't be easy," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "But he has the will to fight. I can see it in his eyes." James nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. With Sophie's guidance, he began incorporating gentle exercises and stretches into Blaze's routine. One evening, as James was brushing Blaze under the soft glow of the barn lights, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The stallion leaned into the brush, his eyes half closed in what could only be described as contentment. James paused, his heart swelling with emotion. For a moment, it felt as though Blaze had finally let go of some of the weight he carried. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start, a sign that trust and healing were possible. But just as James began to feel hopeful, a knock on the barn door shattered the quiet night. He turned to see a tall figure silhouetted against the moonlight. The man stepped inside, his boots crunching on the straw. "You must be James," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've been looking for that horse." James froze, his grip tightening on the brush. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone guarded. The man took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "I'm someone who knows exactly what that horse is capable of." The man's presence filled the barn with an uneasy tension. His sharp eyes swept over Blaze before locking onto James. "Name's Lucas," he said, his voice steady but laced with authority. "I used to work with Daniel Carter. That horse isn't just any stallion. He was part of a training program for competitive endurance. But Carter? Well, he pushed him too far." James could feel his pulse quicken as Lucas spoke. "Why are you here?" James asked, keeping his tone firm, despite the rising unease in his chest. Lucas's expression softened, but there was something guarded in his demeanor. "When I heard someone bought that horse, I had to see for myself," he said, gesturing toward Blaze. "He's special, you know, more than Carter ever realized. But he's also damaged. Horses like him, they don't always recover." James stepped in front of Blaze protectively. "He's recovering now. I don't need your judgment or your doubts." Lucas raised his hands in mock surrender. "Easy, kid. I'm not here to take him. I just thought you'd want to know the truth." As Lucas began to explain, a picture of Blaze's past became clearer. The stallion had been bred for endurance races, pushed to his limits in grueling training sessions. Carter had seen potential but had ignored the signs of physical and emotional strain. When he broke down, Carter tossed him aside, Lucas admitted, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. He didn't care about the damage he'd done. But I saw what that horse could be. With the right care, he could thrive again. James's jaw tightened. "Then why didn't you help him back then?" Lucas hesitated, his silence speaking volumes. After a long pause, Lucas spoke again. "I wasn't strong enough to stand up to Carter. That's something I have to live with. But you've already done more for that horse than anyone else ever did." James didn't respond immediately, his mind racing with questions and emotions. Lucas's story confirmed what James had suspected all along. Blaze wasn't broken by nature, but by neglect and cruelty. "So why tell me this now?" James finally asked. Lucas's eyes met his, steady and sincere. "Because you're his second chance, and I want to help if you'll let me." James didn't know whether to trust Lucas, but one thing was certain. This man knew things about Blaze that could be crucial to his recovery. After a moment of silence, James nodded reluctantly. "All right," he said, his voice cautious. "But if you're going to help, it's on my terms. Blaze comes first." Lucas nodded in agreement. "That's the only way it should be." As Lucas turned to leave, James glanced back at Blaze, who stood quietly watching them. The stallion's journey wasn't over, and with this new twist, James realized they were stepping into uncharted territory. Lucas returned the next morning, this time with a bag slung over his shoulder and an air of determination. James watched warily as the older man approached Blaze's stall, his movements slow and deliberate. Horses like him need patience, but they also need to be reminded of their strength, Lucas said, pulling a bundle of ropes and a lightweight saddle from his bag. "We'll start with groundwork. No pressure, no stress, just showing him he can trust himself again. James hesitated but nodded. He wasn't sure he trusted Lucas yet, but Blaze's progress was his only priority. In the Blue Ridge stables, Lucas demonstrated a series of exercises, using soft commands and fluid movements to guide Blaze. At first, the stallion's reactions were uncertain, his muscles tense with each step, but Lucas's calm, practiced approach seemed to resonate with him. James watched as Blaze began to follow Lucas's lead, his ears flicking forward and his steps growing steadier. "See that?" Lucas said, glancing at James. "He's starting to remember. It's not about control, it's about partnership." James absorbed every detail, determined to learn as much as he could for Blaze's sake. The days that followed were a delicate balance of trust building and careful progression. James took over more of the exercises, his bond with Blaze growing stronger with each session. The stallion began to move with more confidence, his strides longer, his head held higher. For the first time, James saw glimpses of the horse Blaze was meant to be. But with progress came new challenges. Blaze still had moments of fear, flashbacks triggered by sudden noises or unfamiliar situations. James's heart ached every time, but he refused to give up. One afternoon, as they worked together in the field, Lucas approached James with a thoughtful expression. "There's something else you need to know," he said, his voice low. Blaze wasn't just bred for endurance. He was trained for high-stakes races, and if you want him to truly recover, he needs to face the track again, not for competition, but to prove to himself that he can. James's stomach twisted at the idea. The thought of putting Blaze back in a place that had caused him so much pain felt wrong. "I don't know if he's ready," James said, his voice heavy with doubt. Lucas placed a hand on James's shoulder. "You'll know when the time is right. But remember, this isn't about the past anymore. It's about showing him what he's capable of now." James looked back at Blaze, who stood calmly beside them, his gaze steady and full of quiet strength. The idea of returning to a Pine Ridge racetrack felt like a daunting risk. But deep down, James knew Lucas was right. Blaze's journey wasn't just about healing, it was about reclaiming what had been stolen from him. And James was determined to be there every step of the way. The idea of bringing Blaze to a Pine Ridge racetrack lingered in James's mind for days. He wrestled with doubt and fear, questioning whether it was the right decision. Blaze had come so far, but the memories of his past still clung to him like shadows. Could exposing him to the very environment that had broken him truly help him heal? James spent long nights in the stable, sitting by Blaze's side, seeking answers in the horse's calm but guarded gaze. "If we do this," he whispered one evening, "it's on your terms, not mine." James shared his concerns with Lucas, who listened patiently before offering a solution. "There's a private track just outside town," Lucas said. "It's quiet, no crowds, no pressure. It's the perfect place to start." The thought of a controlled environment eased James's anxiety, and after much deliberation, he agreed. They set a date to bring Blaze to the track, giving the stallion time to adjust to the idea. James began incorporating small changes in their routine, introducing Blaze to objects and sounds that mimicked a Pine Ridge racetrack without overwhelming him. When the day arrived, James could feel the tension in his chest as he loaded Blaze into the trailer. The stallion hesitated at first, but with gentle coaxing, he stepped inside. The drive to the track was silent, the hum of the engine underscoring James's swirling thoughts. When they arrived, Lucas was already waiting, leaning against the fence with a calm, confident expression. "Take it slow," Lucas advised as James unloaded Blaze. "This is his moment, not ours." James nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he led Blaze toward the track. At the edge of the track, Blaze stopped, his ears swiveling as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. His muscles tensed, his eyes darting around as if expecting danger. James stood by his side, murmuring soft reassurances. "You're safe," he said, his voice steady. "I'm right here." Slowly, Blaze took a tentative step forward, then another. James walked beside him, letting the stallion set the pace. The first lap was slow and cautious, but as they continued, Blaze's steps grew more confident. By the third lap, his gait was steady, his head held high. Watching Blaze move across the track, James felt an overwhelming sense of pride and relief. The stallion wasn't just walking, he was reclaiming his power, one step at a time. As they completed the final lap, James stopped and turned to Blaze, running a hand along his neck. "You did it," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Blaze snorted, his ears pricking forward as if to say, "We did it." But as James led Blaze off the track, Lucas approached with a serious expression. "This was just the first step," he said. "The real challenge is still ahead." The quiet track had been a milestone, but Lucas's words lingered in James's mind. The real challenge is still ahead. James knew what he meant. Blaze needed to confront a real Pine Ridge racetrack with its chaos, noise, and energy. The thought filled James with dread, but he couldn't deny that Blaze had grown stronger, both physically and emotionally. The stallion was no longer the defeated animal James had first seen at the auction. Yet as much as Blaze had changed, James knew this next step could either cement their progress or unravel everything they'd worked for. James and Lucas spent the following days preparing Blaze for what was to come. They recreated the atmosphere of a crowded track as best they could, playing recordings of cheering crowds and introducing Blaze to unfamiliar equipment. Blaze reacted with unease at first, his old fears bubbling to the surface. But James's patience never wavered. Each day, the stallion grew more accustomed to the new stimuli, his trust in James anchoring him. Still, there was a part of James that questioned whether he was pushing too far, too fast. When the day of the test came, James felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The real Pine Ridge racetrack was a stark contrast to the quiet one they had practiced on. The stands were empty, but the vastness of the space and the echo of distant sounds were enough to make Blaze hesitate as they approached. James placed a reassuring hand on the stallion's neck. "It's just us," he said softly, like always. With a deep breath, he led Blaze toward the starting gate. Lucas watched from the sidelines, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. As James and Blaze entered the track, a staff member released a starting bell. The sharp clang startled Blaze, and for a moment, James feared the worst. The stallion reared slightly, his eyes wide with panic, but James stayed calm, his voice steady. "You're okay," he said, gripping the lead rope with care. "I've got you." Slowly, Blaze's breathing steadied, and his hooves returned to the ground. James gave him space, letting him acclimate before asking for anything more. Minutes later, Blaze took his first cautious step onto the track, then another. James walked beside him, matching his pace. By the time they reached the halfway point, Blaze's movements were more fluid, his ears pricked forward with curiosity rather than fear. When they completed a full lap, James stopped, letting the stallion stand still and take it all in. Blaze's chest heaved, his muscles glistening under the sunlight, but there was a calmness in his demeanor that James hadn't seen before. As they exited the track, Lucas approached, a rare smile breaking across his face. "You've done it," he said, but James knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something greater. The weeks following Blaze's triumph at the Pine Ridge racetrack were transformative. Word spread quickly through the town and beyond about the horse that had defied the odds. People who had once scoffed at James's efforts now spoke of Blaze with admiration, calling him a symbol of resilience. But for James, it was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about giving Blaze the life he deserved, one built on trust, patience, and second chances. As he stood outside the stable one crisp morning, watching Blaze graze peacefully in the Blue Ridge stables, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Lucas, who had become a constant presence in their journey, approached with a thoughtful expression. "You've done more than I thought possible," he said, leaning on the fence. "But I have to ask, what's next for you and Blaze?" James turned to look at the stallion, his gaze steady. "I don't think it's about what's next for me," he replied. "It's about what Blaze wants. He's earned the right to choose his path now." Lucas nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Whatever that is, you'll make sure he's ready." James began to notice subtle changes in Blaze. The stallion moved with a confidence that had once seemed impossible. His eyes, once clouded with fear, now held a quiet strength. Blaze had found his stride, not just physically but emotionally, and it was a transformation that inspired everyone who witnessed it. Sophie, the veterinarian, visited one afternoon and couldn't hide her amazement. "He's incredible," she said, running a hand along Blaze's neck. "You've given him more than a second chance. You've given him his spirit back." James realized that Blaze's journey wasn't just his own. It had become a story that resonated with others. Schools invited James to speak about resilience and compassion, and the local community organized events to celebrate Blaze's recovery. At one of these events, a young boy approached James, his eyes wide with wonder. "Is it true he used to be broken?" the boy asked, pointing to Blaze. James smiled, kneeling to meet the boy's gaze. "He wasn't broken," James said gently. "He just needed someone to believe in him." As the sun set on the Blue Ridge stables that evening, James stood beside Blaze, their silhouettes framed by the golden light. The bond between them was unshakable, forged through challenges, heartbreak, and triumph. The story of Blaze the horse and the young man is a powerful testament to the strength of faith, perseverance, and unconditional love. From physical scars to deep emotional wounds, both the horse and its owner faced unimaginable challenges. Yet through these struggles, they found each other, forming a bond that was not just about healing physically, but a rebirth of trust and hope. Their journey serves as a reminder of the power of patience and care, that anything is possible if we are willing to invest time and heart. As Blaze emerged from the darkness of its past, it not only healed, but became a symbol for all of us to always find light after the darkest nights. Thank you for watching this inspiring story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel so you won't miss out on more emotional and meaningful videos in the future. Share this story with your friends and family, and keep following us as we continue to explore journeys of hope and transformation.